Small and mid-sized businesses make up the majority of our economy. I would say that that's probably the truth worldwide. We in information security historically have done a very poor job supporting them. This is the primary reason why I made the jump into this field 7 years ago. If you look at some of the postings, some of the organizations, some of the conferences, just look at if you go out on a trade floor, for example, or you look at the sessions that are at a conference, how many of those are truly relevant directly for small and mid-sized businesses?
Welcome to Security Beyond the Checkbox, where we interview experts who don't accept the bare minimum when it comes to cybersecurity. I'm your host, Jason Firch, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Greg Schaffer, who is an accomplished cybersecurity professional with over 33 years of information technology and cybersecurity experience. He's also a member of the PurpleSec Cybersecurity Council. He's the founding principal of vCISO Services, LLC, an information security consulting firm specializing in assisting small and mid-sized businesses trying to navigate through the complexities of cybersecurity. Greg is also the host of the Virtual CISO Moment podcast, where he interviews security professionals and shares their stories discussing the information security risks that SMBs face. Greg, I want to thank you so much for taking your time today and lending your expertise to this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Jason. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about everything vCISO.
Awesome. So just for our audience, could you give us a little bit of background of who you are and kind of your journey into security?
So yeah, you mentioned that I have over 30 years of experience in IT and InfoSec cybersecurity. So basically, that's another way of saying that I'm old. But I've seen the growth of the internet and then the introduction of cybersecurity since the beginning. When I started, there wasn't even the concept. Well, there was the concept, but there wasn't in production like Twisted Pair Ethernet. So Ethernet was really, really in its infancy back then. So it affords me an opportunity to have seen the entire growth of the industry from its pre-beginnings to now, and there's been some very interesting ebbs and flows and changes. In some ways, you could say a lot of what happens in the past then happens again. It's cyclical. But basically, my career path has started from part-time network technician. I've done help desk work as well too, all the way through the CISO level at several organizations. And then eventually 7 years ago to forming my own company, vCISO Services, for providing quality and experience in information security risk management expertise to small and mid-sized businesses.
Great. Well, looking forward to diving into these conversations with you. And just really to kind of prime the conversation at hand, I wanted to start off by discussing a recent poll that I ran on LinkedIn, where I asked other security professionals, what is the greatest challenge to small businesses trying to implement a mature security posture in 2024? The results for me weren't too, crazy. 41% said no expertise, or DIY security, as I like to call it, and that's your traditional IT folks who are taking control of security for the organization. 27% said it was either too expensive or they had accrued so much technical debt over the years, legacy systems, things of that nature. 27% said that there is a lack of buy-in from leadership, and 5% said that they were just checking the box. I'm curious to know your thoughts on those results and if that's kind of aligning with what you're seeing in your practice.
Oh, I think it's definitely aligning. It's interesting how several of the items were very close, the first three at least, or somewhat close. But from my perspective, the do-it-yourself or no expertise is the most risky. I ask that question on the Virtual CISO Moment every week. What do you think is the biggest risk to small and mid-sized businesses? And the best answer that I've gotten so far, which I agree with, is bad advice. And so how does that bad advice come about? It starts off with a fundamental lack of understanding of what information security and then cybersecurity as a subset really is. And what I mean by that is there has been traditionally this thought that everything cybersecurity and information security should fall within information technology, and that's understandable because that's where firewalls came from. That I was in networking for the longest time in IT. I was in the group that put in the first firewall at the organization I was with, so it was a natural progression. But there's an issue there, and I realized that issue when I was at that point. I shouldn't be in the same position of dictating who talks to what and then who also gets blocked. I shouldn't be able to give access and then also block and then also audit. Well, that's a kind of a informal way of describing what we call the three lines of defense. And just briefly, the first line is operational IT security management. That is your firewall admins, your SIM monitoring, your antivirus deployment, those sorts of things. Second line is risk management, completely risk management, understanding the threats to the environment, the risks that those threats then pose, and then the controls to put in place to mitigate those threats. You have to have a risk management mindset and skill set to be able to do that. And then third is audit, which comes around to make sure that first and second line are doing what they're supposed to do. So we get back to the no expertise or do-it-yourself security. The no expertise, usually you'll see in smaller businesses in particular, they're so wrapped up in wanting to grow the business, particularly startups. And they see security as almost a roadblock or a necessary evil. And they really don't know what they don't know. They don't know the structure. They just hope that their MSP or their internet service provider or whomever is going to take care of security for them. And then the do-it-yourself security, maybe you see that a little bit higher up the line, because one of the first things that small businesses as they grow have to do is they have to have some sort of IT support. In fact, pretty much once you start a business, you have to have some sort of IT support in some way, shape, or form. And so the security usually then falls to those folks. But IT folks are not security folks. They don't think like risk managers. They don't have risk management goals or duties because they're first line, not second line. So what I try to do when I first start talking with small or mid-sized businesses about this, whether it be a prospect coming in or just general at a conference, or if I'm doing a talk somewhere, or sometimes on the podcast, is I try to explain the three lines of defense first and foremost, because really that's talking in the business language as opposed to the techie language, and you want to talk in the business language always for the business. Now, the other two, no, too expensive or technical debt or lack of buy-in from leadership, the other two that had some significance there, yeah, we see that as well too. But usually, by the time that a prospect comes to me or to an organization like my organization, those two have already been sort of already addressed. They realize it's going to be expensive, but they need to know they have to spend some sort of cost, otherwise they wouldn't be reaching out. And the lack of buy-in from leadership, well, I always tell folks that if they contact vCISO services and they're just looking for compliance and they don't have the lack of buy-in from leadership, they need to go somewhere else, because you're looking basically for more like a virtual ISO or a tactical IT security person or even a compliance officer. You're not looking for real strategic risk management.
Yeah, and the analogy that I've liked to use around the DIY security is like back in the late 90s, you have the AV guy walk in and the CEO points at him and says, "You're in charge of IT now." And I'm seeing that, and I'm sure you're seeing it too, where that's kind of the case with IT. So, so I want to take kind of a step back from the pool there and kind of dig a little deeper into what are the roles and responsibilities of a vCISO.
Well, now to understand this, we need to go back to the beginning of the virtual CISO and how it's evolved, how the terms evolved, because when someone says virtual CISO today, that may or may not be the same as it was about a decade ago. And it was probably about a decade ago when I first became aware of the term, 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. And what it was an analogy to some of the other virtual or fractional type of C-suites out there. It was basically somebody who had been a CISO or equivalent. What I mean by that, as the senior executive in information security risk management, sometimes they call them CISOs, sometimes they don't. Most of the time, CISOs aren't real chiefs anyway. They don't report to the CEO or the board. That's just the way it is. And so yeah. CISO is a bad acronym in and of itself, but that's another story. But the point being is that you had those folks, the full-time information security risk management executives that were then providing that services to smaller businesses that didn't need to hire someone full-time, the same experience. And that was very important back then because the CISO salary was starting to get very, very expensive, and a lot of SMBs. I think right now the number I quote is just south of $300,000 total compensation, your average for your CISO in the United States. Now, of course, that it takes into a lot of considerations, and location, size of company, industry, all that stuff. But it's expensive. Now, somewhere along the line, a couple of things happened. First, you had some folks, and there was actually a famous LinkedIn post about this about a year and a half ago, that pushed the idea that you could just call yourself a vCISO. And if you do that, then you can gain experience with small and mid-sized businesses, learn on the job training, I guess. And then suddenly you can leap start your career and that's how you can enter into cyber, which is a horrible, horrible piece of advice, because the whole point is that you're supposed to be selling yourself, what you have accumulated as far as knowledge and experience, and not the other way around, where the small and mid-sized business is expecting that from you, but you're really just using them as a training ground. So that's just horrible. It's not ethical. And the other one, which has problem ethics as well too in some ways, is that it became a lucrative field. And so once something ever becomes lucrative, everybody wants to have part of the pie. And in particular, you see sometimes managed security service providers. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But what ends up happening now is that you have these groups, these people. You go and they put vCISO in their headline on LinkedIn, or they tout themselves as offering virtual CISO services. Look at their background and what it is that they have done in the past. And a lot of them do not have anywhere close to the experience. So having said that, from my perspective, the role and responsibility of a true virtual CISO is to emulate what a CISO does for a larger organization. No pluses, no minuses. And what does a CISO do for a large organization? They don't handle the firewall rules. They make sure that there is separation of duties. They make sure that the rules are audited, that user access is audited, that risk assessments are done, that policies are created and updated, and not from template, because it's very easy to go to our friend ChatGPT and say, hey, why don't you write me an acceptable use policy? Whoop-de-doo. I mean, we were able to download templates 10 years ago. That's not information security risk management. That's taking the lazy way out. CISOs don't do that. But there are virtual CISOs out there that are doing exactly that. They're sort of virtual CISO in name only. And so what's going to happen with the virtual CISO field, I'm not so sure. There has been some talk that um, we need to split or create a new name, that the virtual CISO moniker has become too soiled. I don't know if I agree with that yet. Some have suggested using fractional CISO instead, but the problem with that is that typically has been reserved for something that is more on site, fractional CFO being probably the most common of that. Whereas a virtual CISO usually is and traditionally has been delivered for the most part virtually. Um, you could say information security risk manager or consultant, but then that gets muddied as well too. Um, I think that one response on LinkedIn probably said it best. When you're providing your services, whatever you call it, it doesn't matter. But so long as the client understands what you're offering, why you're offering it, how you're offering it, and that you can deliver on those services. Now, that means that the client needs to be able to understand what it is they're looking for in a virtual CISO.
Right, and we'll touch upon that one as well. So, the next question that kind of comes to mind is, what are some of the main benefits that a small business might gain from hiring a vCISO such as yourself versus trying to do it themselves?
Well, again, now, first of all, the split between the true virtual CISO and the vCISO Eno, which I call vCISO in name only. We'll just say vCISO Eno right now. It's just easier to say. Um, so if you have a true virtual CISO, then you get what I explained before, and that is whether it be me or someone on my staff or another virtual CISO, you have years of experience of actually doing this full time. And what does that mean? It means we've actually been, quote unquote, in the trenches. We've talked with the board of directors. We've stood there. First time I talked with board of directors, it was very intimidating. And I get that. Most vCISOs out there have no idea. The ones that vCISOinos, they have no idea to have how to talk to a board because they've never done it before. So again, we're selling experience. We've been there, we've done it, we can show it, we can prove it, we can tell stories, we can show successes. Um, and the reason why that a small or mid-sized business would need that is because they have the same information security risk management concerns and needs as a larger business. They sometimes just don't realize that, or they can't describe that in a way that they yet understand. It's almost like that they'll understand more about why this is important as the virtual CISO relationship goes on. Now, if you have a vCISO coming in and laying on top of them ChatGPT generated policies using a vCISO platform, which all that is just a glorified method to bring information together, which I think some of the platforms are really great out there, don't get me wrong, but they're just that. They're just platforms. Just because you have a virtual CISO platform does not make you a virtual CISO. Just like if I use QuickBooks, I'm not a CFO. And it's the experience there. And if they try to do the do-it-yourself security, you're not going to have that experience. Even if they bring in someone who is not in IT, but they've never had that experience before, it's going to be rather difficult. Sometimes they'll have like legal do it, or they'll have compliance officer do it. Again, when all is said and done, particularly if a small or mid-sized business is looking down to needing to become compliant with any one of the many frameworks or standards out there, you really need someone who has that experience. You don't want to do it yourself. I'm not going to like wire my house, for example, by myself because I know the danger there. I'm going to hire someone to do it.
Right, exactly. Um, could you give some specifics or maybe some stories behind, from your experience, what those risks look like when you try and do things yourself?
Well, if you don't know the landscape, if you've never done a risk assessment, for example, um, it's very difficult to understand what the risks are. It's very difficult to identify. So let's start with something simple. A simple approach to any security program is to take a framework like the CIS 18 or the NIST cybersecurity framework, look at the requirements there and do a gap analysis, and then do a risk analysis against the gap analysis. Well, the gap analysis is pretty easy. You need multi-factor authentication. You don't have it. There's a gap. Okay. Well, now when you're starting to talk about the risk, then you start to have to understand about the concept of, well, we talk about risk assessments qualitative in terms of likelihood and impact. It's almost like an acquired skill as opposed to just a knowledge test, and almost an art in some ways. You have to understand how it affects the business. So you have to look outside of the risk itself. I remember one time a long time ago, I was very adamant about not encasing a conduit in concrete for where we were laying fiber for this one organization, because I'm like, well, it's going to get dug up, and our standards are you have to do that. Well, I wasn't thinking risk management because it costs $7 a foot to be able to do that in concrete, whereas $1 a foot for not using concrete. And the part that I didn't take into account is that that was in an area of this campus that was never ever slated to have any sort of digging done or anything in 20 years. And so the CFO said, we're never going to dig there in 20 years. I'm not going to pay 7 times for it. And I was all adamant about it. Well, it's not my fault if it gets dug up and all that, but I wasn't thinking like a risk manager. And 23 years later, they haven't dug there. So, I mean, he was right. But that's really sort of the risk mindset, the risk difference that even some CISOs nowadays, I don't think that they actually have that skill set. It is not easy to attain. It sounds easy, but it isn't.
Mhm. So up to this point, we've kind of talked through some of what those challenges that we're seeing in the landscape. We've discuss some of the roles, responsibilities of a vCISO, talk through the benefits and some of the risks. So I'm a small business. I'm starting my security journey. When should I, as a small business, start to consider hiring a vCISO?
Immediately, call me. No,
Good
no.
answer.
No, really, you should always be thinking about security from the get-go, but you should have some sort of input when you start growing your business, whether it be a virtual CISO or some sort of, at this point in time, a security consultant, even more on the first line of defense is fine. You can start out in the IT security area because I mean, the majority of the risks when you're a smaller business is going to be more on the IT security risk side. So we have a service called a virtual ISO for that. It's more tactical, less strategic. In fact, it's very little strategic. And it makes more sense from there. But then as you start talking about data retention requirements, compliance requirements, if you start ingesting actual consumer data and you're responsible for that, you have to get cyber insurance. A lot of the times, I think you're going to see this more and more, that you're going to have a virtual CISO type consultant just for meeting cybersecurity insurance requirements, because they're not just doing a questionnaire anymore. They want to make sure you actually understand the risks instead of saying, yes, I've got this, yes, I've got this, yes, I've got that. So that's one area. Now that's more ideal, and that doesn't happen most of the time. A lot of times what happens is that folks will want to bring in a virtual CISO when they start having to meet some sort of regulatory requirement or some attestation framework. So the latter would be like, say, SOC 2 or PCI. The former might be high trust, for example. And these are usually customer or prospect driven. And so now, in their eyes, security now becomes a business enabler. By that point in time, but it would make more sense if they had contracted with a virtual CISO prior to that. Whether that be on a regular basis or some sort of retainer basis depends upon the scope of the need of the engagement.
Right. So just to kind of summarize that, if you're maybe like a plumber or lawn care or company, maybe you've got like 10 people on your staff and you're looking to do some level of security, a virtual CISO may not really make sense, but
Yeah.
you want the more tactical. But if you're, say, starting to get into the 20, 50 plus employee size and you're in the healthcare industry, you have those other considerations that you need to account for.
Well, sometimes it's not employee size, though, because you could have a
Okay.
lawn care agency that has 50 employees, but they're not really dealing much with like sensitive information. So just some good IT security consulting for if they're using Microsoft 365, for example, make sure that they've got things set in. And a lot of times, too, it's like I have a very, very good web service provider that provides security for the web page and reports once a month. That sort of stuff would be fine. But then you can have in my case, I'm working with an 8-person startup right now that they're building an application, so that they need to have security built in. They're already ingesting information from their clients as they start bringing stuff in, and if they lose that information, it's going to be huge for them. So if there's not a one size fits all, it really comes down to the information that they have and the risk to the information there and the risk to the business if that information either got out or was not accessible.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the confusion, especially when we talk about the complexity of security. What do I need? Or what do I want versus what do I need? And a lot of people might think that they need to have a vCISO for this, that, and the other thing, when in that case, they're not ingesting that data, they're not doing anything around those routes. Their needs are very different. Because a lot of the times these prospects, like you said, it's driven by, vendor requirements or insurance requirements. They're just doing it because they have to. They would rather focus back onto their business. They don't want to spend the time and money and resources trying to figure out security. So let's say, I am in that category where I fit the criteria for needing a vCISO, what should small businesses look for when hiring a vCISO? And maybe even to add on to that, what are some of the questions that they should be asking?
I kind of mentioned this beforehand in the preamble about what a virtual CISO is, but what you should look for, at least from the resource, is their experience. You should look into then also, what's the best way to say this? I'm gonna open up this can of worms for a second. You need to understand their motivation. And what I mean by that is that there are some cases, and this is certainly not the norm. I want to be clear about that to begin with. But there are some cases with managed security providers, managed service providers, or managed security service security providers, too many acronyms here, that they will provide a virtual CISO service that may or may not be more along the lines of a virtual ISO, which there's nothing wrong with that, and B, may be acting sometimes subconsciously as an inside salesperson for the MSP. Now, let me explain that for a second. What I mean by that, we've talked about gap analysis and determining risks. If you're employed by an MSP that sells a certain product to mitigate a risk, you may have a bias for finding gaps or prioritizing gaps or both that then that solution can then solve. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's ubiquitous across the board, but you have to understand the motivation of the virtual CISO. You have to look into also, if you are contracting with a virtual CISO, whether it be a person or a service, one of the things you don't want to have happen is to have virtual CISOs come and go. You want to make sure that whomever is assigned to your account, I mean, there's going to be staff turnover. That's just the way things are. But in general, you want someone that's going to stay with you for an extended period of time. And why is that? Because when you first, as a virtual CISO, when we first start engagements, you have this ramp up period where you're spending time learning the environment, learning the as is. You gain all of this institutional knowledge. And the more institutional knowledge you have, the better you can help identify and prioritize and then mitigate risks, because that's the way that you want to do it. You want to prioritize and then mitigate risks based on the risk to the business, not based on any sort of external factors. And if you have CISO turnover, vCISO turnover, you may have this next person asking the same questions and missing where not having some sort of control here really affects the bottom line of the organization, or could. And then some very basic stuff. You want to look for references. You want to make sure that they have adequate insurance, liability. The cyber may not be a bad idea as well too. They should practice what they preach. They should, the virtual CISO, either as a contractor or more likely as a firm, they should have an information security policy and be able to show that they do a risk assessment, that they do their vendor management as well too. All these things comes together, and you know what, Jason, that just, you made me think about that. It's like maybe putting together a small pamphlet, like checklist, things to look for in a virtual CISO. That might not be a bad idea someday.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you touched upon this about briefly when we were talking about the roles and responsibilities, not having, vCISO not having that experience talking to the board, getting that stakeholder buy-in. So the question really is, how do I, as a small business, maybe I'm an IT director and my task has been to secure the organization. I'm taking lead on the project. How do I communicate effectively to executives and stakeholders to get their buy-in so that the proper investments into security are made?
You know, the good thing, one of the really good things about our field is that that's one of those questions that many people will answer in a different way. And when that happens, everybody gets the experience from somebody else. What my preferred way to do this, or a recommendation, may be different from someone else's. But what I always recommend, again, is to try to go back to the 3 lines of defense. Now, that's going to mean that the IT person needs to learn and understand that at first. a lot of times, and how I sell this idea is that you start out with the idea, it's like, look, you're on IT, you're not responsible for risk. Okay. The information in the system that you're keeping up, you're not responsible for the risk to that information. They can't lay it on you. You're responsible for ensuring that people can get to that. So, okay, maybe there's that availability thing to an extent, but we're talking about the confidentiality and all of that. It's like that's a different segment, and you shouldn't have to take that on yourself. And a lot of times you'll see IT folks in their mission to want to show their value that they do want to take on that. And it's like, you don't have to, you don't want to, you shouldn't take on that liability. Well, then what am I going to do? Well, then now understand the three lines of defense. That's a second line, that's a risk management line. Who is handling risk management in your organization? Well, I don't think anybody is. Well, then that's your problem. That's why you need to go out and at least talk with a risk management virtual CISO or virtual CISO firm to understand that.
Hmm. So when we're thinking about, you're taking on an engagement, you have client buy-in to an extent, right? You don't know until you actually get in under the hood. What are some of those most common challenges that you see that vCISOs face when trying to make an impact on an organization?
Well, one of the things that makes it difficult is first of all being remote. Now, because of the experience, that's kind of changed somewhat. We've become, as a society, more used to being remote, but that doesn't remove the fact that um, you lose something by not having face-to-face communication. And I do believe the more nuanced the communication, again, when you're talking risk, sometimes body language or eye contact or those sorts of things are so important. And a CISO or a virtual CISO's main mission is to to it's predicated on those relationships. And so if you can't build those relationships or as effectively as being in person, that makes it more difficult. Now, for the virtual CISO, add on the fact that this isn't a full-time position. Most virtual CISO, you're talking maybe 5 hours a week, something like that. It depends on the customer's need, but you don't have that touch point. And sometimes you don't have the access to some of the SMEs like you would need to. You definitely need to force that issue because usually we either work through risk or IT or finance or something along a combination thereof, but we don't have access to other departments that we may need to talk to, like marketing, for example, native access. So you need to make sure you establish that. Um, you also have the issue of just as a virtual CISO, I'm drawing a little bit of a blank here. Um, you don't have the touch points. You don't have um, you should have the executive buy-in at that point in time, but you also have the same potential conflict of interest. I'm not an advocate of the virtual CISO or the CISO reporting into the CIO because of conflict of interest needs. Um, that's a first line, second line cross. Now, I always say there's a caveat to that. That can be managed. But as one example I'd like to give, we had a client that we reported directly into IT, but we didn't have despite our requests, we were told that we don't need to review firewall rules. And that's a problem because right there, that's sort of like information security governance 101. That is the baseline of separation of duties. And there was nothing we could do to convince them or the business that we needed that. Now, I'm of the opinion that the virtual CISO should tell the client not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. And that's what we did. And eventually we had to dissolve the relationship. But that gets back to the bad advice. Sometimes you'll have it's not just virtual CISOs, it's any consultant. It's your natural tendency. You don't want to lose a client. It's like, okay, you don't want us to do this. We'll just go along with it and go on. You're doing them a disservice. From my perspective, I'd rather lose all my clients, but tell them what they need to know than keep all my clients and grow and tell them what they want to hear.
Yeah, that's a great perspective to have. And you've mentioned this a few times, the CISO traditionally is reporting to the CIO, CFO, and I've talked to other CISOs about this too, and it seems to be this reoccurring problem where you have people who don't have that deep expertise in security making decisions for security. And I think it's been a struggle. Over the last couple of years, it's gotten a little bit better, having the CISO at the boardroom, having a seat at the table, more direct report up. Do you see that continuing to kind of change in that direction, or do you think we're kind of stuck in the moment right now where those that corporate hierarchy is just kind of set for CISOs?
I think it's kind of set, quite honestly. I have seen movement ebbs and flows over the last 10 or 15 years, one way or the other. I think what I've seen more of a direction to is that it doesn't necessarily matter where the CISO or the virtual CISO sits, so long as there are provided the resources and the authority commensurate with the responsibility. So I mentioned beforehand that I'm not a fan of a CISO reported to a CIO, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. It can be easily managed correctly. And if you do that, that's fine. Your reporting structure doesn't matter so much as your authority that, again, is commensurate with the responsibility. So I see more of a movement that way. More organizations are understanding the risk that information provides. Of course, we've had recently the SEC with SolarWinds and those sorts of things. And again, there's always like several like big stories of the year that moves the needle on cybersecurity and information security. So it's like, yeah, okay, I sometimes take it with a grain of salt. We'll see where it goes. But the movement generally has been, I think, more towards more of a risk understanding for the organization. So the most important officer of the organization is one where you don't really see it too often, in my opinion. That's chief risk officer. Now, you see that a lot in banking because banking, their entire business model is based on like 8 different types of risks, or 9, depending upon who you talk to. I can never remember which. But because of the realization that information security is a risk issue and not an IT issue. Now that has changed. That has been a significant movement. The board and the C-suite are going to want to make sure it's managed correctly. If that means that the CISO, wherever the CISO fits, whether in the organization, whether they report to the board or they report to audit committee or they report to the CEO or they report to one of the Cs or further down, as long as they have the responsibility and the independence and the communication completely up the chain, it doesn't matter too much where they sit, my opinion.
Good perspective there too. My last question here is more for those who are aspiring to move into a CISO or vCISO role. Do you have any tips or recommendations for them to kind of help them out in their journey?
Well, I'm going to get back to the first one with the vCISO. I don't think you should be a vCISO unless you have significant information security risk management experience. Now, I'm not going to say that you had to have been a CISO, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you have that risk management experience. No certificate, no certification can do that for you. No wordsmithing of experience or putting things in titles can do that for you. Now, having said that, let's get back to the whole being a CISO or information security risk management executive. That's not a technical position. I think the best CISOs are those that are technical CISOs. They grew up through their career through the technical side, and I'm biased because that's what I did. But some come from legal, some come from accounting. There are different paths, and that's fine. But particularly most who are coming from the cybersecurity side. See, cyber is a subset, in my opinion, of information security. So cyber is more of the technical side, but now you've got to learn more about information security, which is more about the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance. You have to think like a risk manager. You have to understand risk management, and you have to understand the methodologies, the limitations. It's a tool to use. And you also have to understand the business. Now, that's one of the things that I tell folks when they're in IT. If they're using IT as a leverage to get into cyber, which I think is a good idea, because particularly at help desk or networking, those are the 2 positions in IT that you really get an opportunity to see the whole organization. and you get a leg up on others because now you know the business. It's not to say you need that in order to get into cyber, but in cyber, you have, which I term cybersecurity as being something along the lines of like a pen tester, vuln tester, threat hunter, SOC analyst, those sorts of things. If you're looking in a vacuum and you don't have even a little bit of a risk management standpoint, then you're just going to alert on just the basic risk score that comes across on your SIM or what have you. You're not going to be able to understand the true risk of the organization. And maybe as a junior SOC analyst, that's all you need to do. But long story short, you need to have some sort of technical acumen, but you need to understand risk management and business communication, because when you're a CISO, when you're talking to the C-suite and the board of directors, you're not going to be talking to them in terms of risks of CVSS score. Did I have that acronym right? I always get it backwards.
Yeah, CVSS,
Thank you.
VPSS. There's so many different. Vulnerability management scoring is a little crazy.
but the board and the C-suite, they don't care about that. They just care about what does it mean to the business. So you better be able to have the acumen to be able to tell them this is what this means to the business and why. And if you can't do that, you have no business being a CISO or a virtual CISO.
That's a fantastic point. Well, Greg, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close it out here?
Small and mid-sized businesses make up the majority of our economy. I would say that that's probably the truth worldwide. We in information security historically have done a very poor job supporting them. This is the primary reason why I made the jump into this field 7 years ago. If you look at some of the postings, some of the organizations, some of the conferences, just look at the, if you go out on a trade floor, for example, or you look at the sessions that are at a conference, how many of those are truly relevant directly for small and mid-sized businesses? Now, yes, you could say that there's a tangential relevance because they have SOCs that are supporting them. I get that. But we don't focus nearly enough on the needs of small and mid-sized businesses in our community. And I would like to see that grow a lot more. And quite honestly, that's my passion and my goal, I guess my mission for this part now in my career.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of room to grow in that. We see it certainly on our end too. Very underrepresented. People just kind of want to sell shiny tools and kind of end the conversation there and say, "Oh, you're good to go." Well, Greg, I really do appreciate the time, your experience, and your expertise lending to this conversation. What are some ways that people can find you out on the web if they want to connect?
You can go to our website, which is vcisoservices.com. You can email me directly, greg.schaffer@vcisoservices.com. You can just look me up on LinkedIn. If you're in IT, information security, cybersecurity, risk management, entrepreneur, happy to connect with you. Don't try to sell me anything, though. I'm adamant about that. That's the worst thing when you connect with someone on LinkedIn, the next thing you know, they're trying to sell you something. That's almost an immediate block. And I'm sorry, but that happens way too often. But we'd definitely love to hear from folks.
Yeah, it's a minefield on LinkedIn sometimes. But we'll definitely add all of that into the description of the video. Thank you again for your time, Greg. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.